Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. In this episode, I share a conversation with a longtime friend of mine, Jonathan Taplin. Jonathan and I met in the most unlikely place for an actual friendship, the internet. Jonathan is a truly accomplished entrepreneur, filmmaker, and really a visionary. Jonathan is a man of the left. He came up through the 60s. He worked with Bob Dylan and worked with Martin Scorsese on the film Mean Streets. And yet, he was advocating for a new era of decentralization, what he called Federalism 2.0. And I'm excited to share his insights and our conversation with you now. So, Jon Taplin, I want to recall how we first met, and that is I had come across a book. I was getting into this phase in my life where I was becoming very interested in sort of political philosophy. This is like maybe 2006 and 7, and I came across this book that seemed very interesting, called Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg. And I didn't even read the book. I saw Jonah give like a talk on YouTube, I think. And I wondered, before I read this book, I would really like to see what other people, somebody from a different, Jonah's a conservative. I was like, is there someone from another point of view who's read this book and reviewed it, or what's the reaction to this book before I spend the time to read it? Is this a legitimate argument? Is what's going on here? And so as I searched for that, I came across a book review that you had written about the book. And what was more interesting to me right away was that your blog was a kind of decentralization manifesto from someone who's professed themselves to be on the political left. You called it New Federalism or Federalism 2.0 or something to that effect. And so I began to engage in the comments on your blog, and it became, this is, I think, a little bit of a pre-Facebook time. It became one of my almost daily activities was engaging with you and the community on your blog posts. And so first is, what do you remember of, because it was a fairly small, like it was kind of a tight group of commenters. What was your reaction to this, bright-eyed new little all the zealotry of a convert libertarian jutting into your blog?
I realized that, I believe this was probably 2007, right?
I think it was right around there, yeah.
Yeah, and obviously for someone on the left to be very much Jeffersonian I was an outlier. And, the left for 40, 50 years had believed that all great things come from Washington. And that was probably had to do with FDR, the New Deal, and then the Civil Rights Movement, where, the federal government intervened on behalf of black folks in Mississippi. And so in some sense, it really did help. But I had come to the belief that it was now just the opposite, that, there was more progressive legislation, more progressive ideas coming out of the states, and quite honestly, they were often being blocked by the federal government from doing things. And whether it was, gay rights or, gun control or other things, nothing great was coming out of the federal government. And of course, once Newt Gingrich took control of the Congress, and then it seemed like we were in a Republican era of congressional control, nothing was really going to happen there. So when you joined, I found it to be really interesting because you were clearly what I would call a right libertarian. I mean, but you were more a libertarian than you were a conservative.
Yeah, certainly.
And so that was a really interesting voice. And so I found the dialogue that went around that blog for 2 years to be incredibly fun and fascinating. And so, I mean, it was a strange kind of cross purpose. And, obviously I have continued to be at cross purposes with the left. I recently wrote a cover story for Harper's Magazine about how to avoid a second civil war. And the theory was you have to let the states have much more control over their own destiny if you want to, not have complete chaos in America.
I got so much out of the interactions online together that when I was in Los Angeles, I think for a Spike TV shoot of one kind or another, somehow I got a hold of your phone number, or maybe I emailed you and we had a back and forth, and we ended up, I remember meeting up face to face for lunch at some very typically Los Angeles place to get lunch. And I really wish and I hope that more people would do that and would take the time to sit face to face with people that they maybe don't agree with philosophically, because I feel like it's been such a fundamental thing, and we've continued to be friends over the years now. It's now over a decade, right? 2007 is 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And I feel like we found common ground at a human level pretty quickly in our conversation.
Completely.
You're one of the most, I think you were named as one of the most socially savvy professors. And so among your many accolades, so what do you make of the way modern social media has impacted us at like the sociological level? I know there's a lot to be said there, but before we sort of take a deep time machine into your past, you've been this head of the Annenberg Innovation Lab. You've done some really amazing stuff around social media trends and analysis. And what's your hot take on where we're at right now?
Well, I think it's problematic right now. I mean, I think people like Mark Zuckerberg, and I mean, I think there's a big difference between the blogs that were happening in 2005 to say 2010, which were relatively distributed, decentralized media, compared to the centralization that happened once Facebook and Twitter kind of entered the sphere and kind of sucked up all the oxygen. And the problem is that, on a blog, you could read every single comment and every single piece that does. But on Facebook, an algorithm is really filtering a lot of what you may have, 3,000 friends or more, but you're not getting everything. You're getting a filter that Facebook's deciding, well, I'm going to show you this because I know that you kind of like this. And so what's happening is you're getting a very balkanized media stream that, from Facebook's point of view, is not going to upset you.
Right.
Is not going to get you mad at Facebook. In other words, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff that fits your media or your political preferences. And for me, I think that's horrible, because the very thing that was so fun about that era of 2007, 2008, leading up into that election, was that people, you know, as whack job as Morgan Worstler, were corresponding with each other, you know, and they weren't just yelling at each other. They were actually writing fairly long pieces defending their point of view. And so, I mean, and certainly you and I had a really interesting dialogue via the computer for a long time, but it wasn't like, you know, 246 characters. People would write a page-long response to something. And so that to me was a lot more healthy than a world that's mediated by a very centralized system and quite honestly filtered, and most of the pieces of content that don't fit what Facebook thinks I want to see, I don't even get to see.
It's especially interesting, and I think increasingly troubling to me to think about the extent to which the technology is actually going to keep getting better at showing us things that confirm our tribes and our biases. You know, the AI deep learning algorithms are now starting to be able to understand natural language in a way where they can, you know, we can have a robot that's basically curated to only show us stuff that will make us feel increasingly nuanced ways with accuracy.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's funny because in a very real sense, you're kind of hardwired to be contrarian in your tribe. How did that, you know, just that sense of being comfortable being going against the grain, where did that start for you? You know,
Bob Dylan.
Yeah. So tell me, you know, we never really got a chance to talk through your history your history. And how did you, you know, start with that? Start with Dylan.
I was lucky enough in 1965, so I'm going to date myself. You know, I'm 71. So in 1965, as I was about to go to Princeton University, I went in July of 1965 to the Newport Folk Festival. And because my brother knew a friend of Dylan's, I got a backstage pass to the Newport Folk Festival, which was like a 4-day event. And I got to meet Bob's manager and eventually Bob. And Bob's manager hired me to work for one of his other bands, which was called the Jim Kweskin Jug Band. And I started working as a road manager at the age of 18. So, you know, this notion of you shouldn't do what the crowd is telling you to do, I mean, was evident right there at Newport. So it was called the Newport Folk Festival because it was filled with folk music. But on a Saturday afternoon, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, which was an electric band made up of both white Chicago Jewish guys like Mike Bloomfield and Paul Butterfield, and black players like Sam Lay and Jerome Arnold, who were from Muddy Waters' band, and they were the best rhythm and blues band that existed. And they were managed by Albert Grossman, who was Dylan's manager. And they were playing at a workshop, and Alan Lomax, who was the king of folk music, literally tried to pull the plug to disconnect the electricity. He was so pissed off that they were letting these white blues guys play and play electric at a folk festival. So Dylan got a hair up his ass and just decided on the spot on a Saturday afternoon that he was going to go play electric music on the Sunday night concert where he was the star. He was the closing act. And he got the Butterfield band to back him up. And it wasn't well rehearsed and it wasn't that great, but it was amazing. And it was like the Sacre de Printemps being performed in Paris for the first time. It was like outrage. People were booing, people were throwing things. It was like crazy. And so the whole notion that you should do what you want to do, and it often may not go along with the crowd, is right. And you know, at that point, those people, the folkies, wanted Bob still to be the protest singer singing civil rights songs in a blue work shirt. And he was in a black leather jacket with a bright orange shirt buttoned to the top and wearing high-heeled boots from England, you know. And it was not what they were expecting, either visually or musically or anything. And it was, to me, astonishing. And then he hired the band to become his full-time backup band. And then I joined up with them 2 years later to become their tour manager. And, you know, I graduated from Princeton in '69 and moved to Woodstock. And I joined the rock and roll circus. And I was lucky enough that I could do that. I mean, to be honest with you, and because I've known you for a while, I feel I can be honest, even though this is public, that, you know, my father had died, and he was the only thing that was keeping me on the straight and narrow to become a lawyer, because he was a lawyer. And so I was kind of released to do what I wanted to do, and I went and, you know, joined the circus. And for the next 10 years, he traveled with Bob and worked for George Harrison, did the concert for Bangladesh, and then eventually wound up in California and met a young film editor named Marty Scorsese and didn't know enough not to put my own money into producing movies and produced Mean Streets.
That is I've heard this, that's one of those classic sayings, right? You know, the first lesson of producing is never put your own money in the project, which it tells you something right away about the sort of strange relationship that Hollywood has with entrepreneurism, because in so many ways filmmakers are creative entrepreneurs in the extreme, and yet there is this there is some like odd, I won't say pathologies.
They even have an acronym for it. It's called OPM. Other people's money.
Right.
But I hadn't heard the acronym. Nobody gave me that clue. But, you know, I mean, quite frankly, just like you, John, you could have labored for years as some kind of assistant to somebody, working your way up until they finally gave you permission to make your own movies. Or you could have just gone and did it, which is what you did and what I did. I was not interested in laboring as an assistant, so I guess the chance that I took, and it turned out to be maybe the smartest investment I ever made, in the sense that I'm still making money from Mean Streets, a considerable amount of money every year, 40 years later.
That is a good investment.
Yeah.
How did that happen? So you moved out to California, and you've spent a decade. And let me ask one more thing about that decade with Dylan and with Harrison in the music scene. Were you a music aficionado, or was it as much just a culture experience? Like, I mean, that you're talking about the vanguard of that Woodstock and sort of cultural revolution that's taking place in the 60s and 70s. So there's a lot of reasons to be excited about being on the road with Bob Dylan, even if you don't like music.
The two were married, you know, quite frankly, at that period, which is different from today. In other words, the culture and the music were completely unified. And of course, I came to Bob Dylan's work from his really early work, which was Blowing in the Wind, and the times they are changing. They were protest songs, right? And they were songs, and I was also involved in the civil rights movement. So in the early days, in the early 60s, it was a political, musical reunion. By the time of Woodstock, and by the time I moved to Woodstock, and then the band played the Woodstock Festival, and, the whole LSD, hippie ethos, that was something different. Quite frankly, people had almost completely given up on politics by 69, at least inside the music business. People had gotten killed for politics. And that is a kind of sobering thing. And so the music began to become this other thing, which was, a lot of that came out of the San Francisco scene. And, we weren't that close to Jerry Garcia, and they were fans of Dylan and the band, and they would make the pilgrimage to come to Woodstock every once in a while. But that scene, the Jefferson Airplane and everything, was not really our scene. And in fact, the band's music was a reaction to that kind of psychedelic music. It was very kind of what we now call Americana. There was no such term in those days, and there was a kind of Austin scene, and there was the Woodstock scene, and they were both kind of related to country music in some ways, but they were also related to rhythm and blues and other roots music. So I think in a lot of senses, the notion that you had to choose between whether it was a culture thing or a music thing is not really something that occurred to us. I mean, I originally approached it as a 13-year-old as a music fan.
Yeah, of course. I think it's funny when I hear you say, the music industry, music sort of community and culture abandons politics at the end of the 60s, and so we end up with disco. Was my
yeah. No, look, but John, it's hard for you to imagine what 1968 was like if your two great political heroes, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, get killed within 3 months of each other.
Right.
Get assassinated. That kind of just kills your spirit. It makes you want to say, well, fuck it. I'm sorry. I'm not going to break my heart here.
There's that, conversation starter. If you could have a time machine and go to any period, where would you go? And it's hard not to. Right now, I mean, I'm 41, but I'm frankly a kid of the 90s. I was born in 77, so
right.
My formative years really are like the era of watching Saved by the Bell. but it's hard not to, at this time, for people my age and maybe younger, to go back to the 1960s because of the incredible the incredible moment that is. You've got this country, America, the most powerful country in the world, the victor of World War II, grappling with how to fulfill its own sort of DNA destiny, if you will, of being a place where all men and women are created and treated equally.
Right.
And the spasms and the chaos that erupts out of saying, hey, we've gotten to this point, it's time. That's kind of narrative interpretation of the time for me, but I think there's a real truth to it that you survive you survive World War II, you have you have a decade and a half of peace and prosperity, and yet there's these deep oppressions that are lingering, and it kind of makes sense anthropologically almost that was the time for these things to surface.
Well, look, I mean, in a lot of senses, there's always been a theory that some people believe that the root of America was in the Declaration of Independence, and some believe it was in the Constitution. And, clearly Lincoln believed it was in the Declaration of Independence. And I think what the 60s, again, did was reassert the notion of the beginnings of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was what we were after. And that had, and maybe that comes as a reaction to the 50s and McCarthyism and all of that. I believe quite honestly that history is kind of cyclical. The new book I'm working on is about that sense of it. And so I do believe that these things come and these periods come, and I will tell you, it was an extraordinary decade and a half. I really think it ran to about 76 or 77, from John F. Kennedy's inauguration until, 77, 78. It was pretty astonishing.
There's this interesting overlay that you have at that same time. You have the women's rights movement, the rise of feminism. You've got the civil rights movement. You have some elements that are reactionary to that traditional reactionary elements, but then you also have sort of other radicals that don't fit as obviously into these paradigms, like Murray Rothbard, called Mr. Libertarian, who's sort of an Ayn Rand, who to some would look like they're the same and yet hated each other.
Right.
Sort of this new intellectual movement on the political right. And yet, certain aspects, especially somebody like Rothbard at the time, could sound like a radical, like somebody in the radical movements on the political left. There was this sort of, everything was up for grabs, it seems like.
I personally, as you know from my book, Move Fast and Break Things, I personally think that Ayn Rand was a bad influence. I think that people like Peter Thiel took her, and maybe even Paul Ryan, took her too seriously, and that she was not, I didn't believe she was a deep thinker. I think that her notion that the embedding of selfishness as like that's all okay, and there is no such thing as a community, or there is no such thing as a culture or anything. I think that's all been pretty harmful, and I think that the fact that Jeff Bezos and Larry Page and Peter Thiel are all kind of acolytes of Ayn Rand is part of the problem, because this notion of move fast and break things is a kind of heartless sense that you can just kind of plow ahead and do what you want, and it's not going to really make any big difference, and it's your right to do that. And I think it's dangerous, and that's really one of the big problems that we're dealing with. I mean, Sheryl Sandberg a few weeks few months ago said, "Oh, I was totally shocked to hear that people had used our advertising targeting tools to target anti-Semitic users." And I thought, how, either she's naive or she's just a good liar. Because I can target women in Memphis, Tennessee who drink bourbon and drive pickup trucks. Why shouldn't I be able to do that?
Well, I imagine there's not necessarily a "I hate Jews" text box that you can click.
No, but it's very easy for them to put.
Have you bought Mein Kampf as in the keyword search?
Yeah, but are you sympathetic to these white nationalist groups?
Right.
And they know that. It was a brilliant thing in The Great Gatsby. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, and he said they were careless people. They smashed up things and then retreated back into their money and their vast carelessness. And I think that's the problem. These people don't have a concern for the knock-on effects. I mean, the very fact that they couldn't understand that their platforms could be used by the Russians to disrupt an election is just insane. And of course, as we now know, they did know it was happening. They just didn't think it was that important.
Well, and I think I don't know what to make of what may or may not have been impactful on that regard, but I think that to some extent, I think Facebook does feel like it's been demonstrated as not a very good actor. I mean, when you're apologizing, your corporate apologies become a meme for how many times you've had to apologize about things that that you've or apologize for claiming that something wasn't happening and then it turns out that it was happening.
Right.
Something going on in that organization.
But they're going to suffer, and they're going to get fined by the FTC big time.
It's an interesting
for that Cambridge Analytica thing.
I want to come back to this, but I also want to. I think there's something very interesting on our way to talking about your latest book, which is that you went through a series of experiences as a disruptor, as someone that was looking to move fast and break some things. And I want to really kind of walk through that journey with you a little bit, so that we can kind of see through those eyes. So you come to Hollywood, you have you catch an auteur wave with Martin Scorsese and Mean Streets. How long do you spend in the film industry at that, as a producer, as somebody that's in the producing and working on projects?
So I did 10 years as a producer. So, I mean, the most important movies that came out of that were Mean Streets, The Last Waltz, a movie called Under Fire, which is a kind of cult classic about the war in Nicaragua and what it is like to be a war photographer. Nick Nolte plays this war photographer, and Gene Hackman plays a reporter that gets killed, and it was based on real events and written by Ron Shelton, who is a fabulous writer who had written a lot of other great movies. And then I was at Walt Disney in '84 producing a movie, and I used to go up to the executive dining room every day for lunch. And when you'd come out of lunch, there would be the president of Walt Disney. His name was Ron Miller. He just died a few weeks ago. And he was president of Walt Disney because he was married to Walt's daughter. Obviously, Walt had died, and so the daughter essentially inherited the company and made her husband the president. He didn't know anything more about movies and creative things than any guy off the street. I mean, he had been a football player. He had been a linebacker for the Los Angeles Rams, and not even a good one. Anyway, he would sit there and play poker with 3 other guys that he had on staff as producers. They never produced anything, but all they were was his poker buddies, and he would play for 3 hours every afternoon. And big money. You could see piles of bills on the table. And it was like such an insult. And at this point, Walt Disney was going down the tubes. They had nothing. And so I went down to Fort Worth, Texas, to see a friend of mine named Richard Rainwater, who was the main investment guy for the Bass Brothers, who was a very big Texas oil fortune. And I said, Richard, you know, Richard had kind of taught me how to read a balance sheet. I had tried to get a little investment in a movie company years before, and he had said to me, John, it's just as much hassle to do a $10 million deal as a $100 million deal. So bring me a $100 million deal, you know. So, I mean, so I came back to him and I said, Richard, well, here's an amazing deal. This is companies being run into the ground, and the whole film library of Walt Disney was valued on its balance sheet at about $64 million.
It's shocking to imagine.
The whole fucking film library. So I said, it's ridiculous. And it's selling at book value, you know. And so he said, Tap, this is a brilliant idea. The problem is we own 9.9% of Texaco. And they want to buy Getty Oil, and we don't want them to buy Getty Oil. So we may have to go up to 20% just to keep them from doing it. And that's another $2 billion. So we don't have the money to invest in Walt Disney. So I went home back to Walt Disney, and about 3 months later, a guy named Saul Steinberg, with the help of Mike Milken, launched a raid on Walt Disney. He bought about 6% of the stock and said he was going to break it up and sell off the pieces. And the management of Walt Disney just flipped out completely. They basically ended up concluding the only way they could save themselves was to sell themselves to Anheuser-Busch, under the guise that Busch Gardens was a theme park and they had a theme park, and somehow that would be okay. And at the last minute, Sid Bass called me with Richard one morning and said, Tap, we just sold all our Texaco stock and we're ready to save the mouse.
Wow.
And so I went down to the chairman's office, Ray Watson, and I said, we're getting on a plane. The Blasses are sending a plane to take us to Fort Worth, and it'll be here in 3 hours at the Burbank airport, and you and I are getting on that plane, and we'll figure this out so you can stay an independent company. And we did, and it worked. And so the Basses paid me a ridiculous amount of money as their investment advisor. And I was a kid, you know, and I made more money in 3 weeks than I'd made in 5 years. And so they said, you should go to work for our real investment banker. So they called Ken Miller, who was the head of the mergers and acquisition group at Merrill Lynch, and said, hire Jon Taplin. And he did. He was cool enough to do it. And so I went to work as an investment banker running the media mergers and acquisition group at Merrill Lynch.
So the Dylan Rhodey ends up at Merrill Lynch. The
Yeah,
ironies there
I
are
was
too much.
known as the house hippie. I didn't shave my beard. But it was okay because I quickly found them another company that was very undervalued, like Walt Disney. Was called Viacom, and we got a horse to ride, which was a guy named Sumner Redstone, who had a theater company and wanted to get in the movie business. And we ended up buying Viacom for Sumner, and it was an amazing deal. I mean, eventually Sumner got too old and ran it into the ground, and I think you had some experience with them at one point. Or it's
Well,
not,
my entire pre-emergent order professional life was spent inside of Viacom, so it's
and so you saw how screwed up.
I think maybe I had my job maybe my job only would have existed because of Jon Taplin. It sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, look, for a long time it was a great company, and then it wasn't because they just completely missed the ball on the digital revolution. They thought that the television business would stay the same forever, and they didn't realize that there was an emergent order.
You know, there's it's funny. I still have a lot of my. I'm actually surprised how long a lot of my core relationships at Viacom have survived. It's now going to be 8 years since I left.
Does Spike TV even exist anymore?
It doesn't. It was so. It doesn't exist in name, and it almost doesn't exist in terms of the internal staff. Spike became a year and a half ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago now, Paramount Network, and then just this past fall, all of the people I loved, with the exception of one, were shown the door. So, and maybe you know these things are always. It's very interesting when you're inside companies like a company like the Viacom channels, because at one level it can feel capricious and like the stock market kind of laying waste to people's lives, but at another level, there is a kind of stasis that can take place inside these bureaucracies of these large companies. And if you don't occasionally have a brush fire, I don't really know what other mechanism there is to clear things out. And that's not a slight against my former colleagues.
No. But John, they were brush fires all the while, and they were just ignoring them.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, the extent to which they've sort of not been able to. I mean, they've kind of become a second-tier media firm in this new age.
Philippe Dumont was the greatest value destroyer in the history of the media business.
It's hard to argue with that assessment. So you're at Merrill Lynch, and you're making some pretty huge deals. I mean, you're reshaping Hollywood with these deals.
Yeah, and then in 1988-89, the rise of the scumbags really began to get to me. So literally because they were so powerful, Mike Milken and Ivan Boesky and people like that were people that were getting legit. You know, they're kind of like Donald Trump. They somehow got, you had to take a meeting with them. And they were really bad people. And I began to feel very conflicted, put it that way.
Sure.
Emotionally conflicted. The 60s part of my being was really getting, revulsion inside the offices of Ivan Boesky. And of course they all ended up going to jail eventually. So they got their just desserts, but I eventually needed to find a way out, and a young German film director named Wim Wenders gave me the way out. He had made an extraordinary movie called Wings of Desire. If you've never seen it, you really should. And he made a movie called Paris, Texas, too, which is also a brilliant movie. And he called me and he said, I want to make this science fiction art movie called Until the End of the World, and I can't find anybody to finance it. Would you come and produce it and raise the financing? And I was just at just the right point. My marriage was coming apart because my wife hated that I was an investment banker. She was more of a hippie than I was. And everything was falling apart, and I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to get in a suit every morning. And so I just said, yeah, where do I sign up? And it ended up being a 3-year odyssey because the movie was shot in 19 countries. You know, Wim is known for the road movies. That was what he called his company, Road Movies. And it was shot on 4 continents, 19 countries, all over the world. And just the scouting took a year. And it was like joining the French Foreign Legion. And it was exactly what I needed at that point in my life. And it got me back into the creative world, which is what I had really missed in the banking world. And I did that, and then I started producing movies again. I made To Die For with Nicole Kidman and Gus Van Sant, and then I made a whole bunch of documentaries for PBS. I made a series called Cadillac Desert, which was about water in the West, and I made another one called The Prize, which is about the history of the oil business. And these were like 9-hour series for PBS and the BBC. And so each of those took a year to make. And then I ended up in 96 at the Sundance Film Festival with a movie called Shine that we'd produced. And
it's a beautiful movie.
It was one of the more notorious parts of my life. I had shown it to Miramax, which was Harvey Weinstein's company, before Sundance to give them the option to take it off the market. And he had sent some underling to see the movie, and the guy had walked out and said nothing and never heard from them. So I assumed they were out of it. And so we showed it on the first night of Sundance, and it's an extraordinary emotional movie about this pianist who's kind of on the spectrum. And Jeffrey Rush is the star. And it just got one of those responses that you always hope for when you have your first screening. You know, everybody was in tears, and it's very emotional and everything. And the movie was over, and I realized there were 5 companies wanting to bid on the movie. And so the next morning, we started negotiating, and eventually Fine Line, New Line, got in the kind of pole position, and we're just about to sign the papers when this stupid guy who had come see the movie a week and a half before called me and said, Harvey is on his way on a plane here just to sign a deal with you. And I said, you had your chance. You know, sorry, we're going to sign with Finally. And he said, don't do it. And I said, no, I'm sorry, you had your shot. And besides, you have way too many movies that you haven't released and everything. So we signed the movie, and we went around out to celebrate with the director and the director's attorney and some other friends at a restaurant. And Harvey Weinstein shows up at the restaurant and grabs me by the collar and pulls me up from the table, literally, you fuck me, you're never going to work in this town again. You know, I mean, it was just outrageous. You know, I'm going to cut you a new one. You know, it was just spewing this bullying shit. And Deb Newmeyer, who was at the table, who was Steven Spielberg's story editor, says to him, Harvey, for once in your life, why don't you take the high road and congratulate John? And he says, fuck you, bitch. And anyway, so he walks away. And
all of Hollywood is now liberated to tell these stories without feeling like there's going to be a knife thrown at them when they leave the room.
Right. And there was a reporter in the room who saw it from Variety. And he immediately leaves and writes it up, you know. And so it's the front page of Variety the next morning, right? And we had just sold the domestic rights to it, right? And so my partner, Ernst Goldschmidt, who was back in Paris, all of a sudden it's the front page of Variety, and every foreign distributor in the world is calling him to try and buy the movie, figuring if Harvey Weinstein would go that far to try and secure it must be worth it. And sight unseen. So we had figured, this movie we made for $1.5 million, right? And I sold the U.S. rights for $5 million. And we figured, before Sundance, we figured the total thing we would get out of the movie was $4 million for the world. And Ernst sold the rest of the world for another $10 million.
Wow.
So we were like $15 million return on a $1.5 million investment.
That movie's special to me because it's part of a set of great movies in the mid 90s, just as I'm getting into college and, you know, looking aspirationally at the movies that are winning Oscars. And
yeah, Jeffrey won the Best Actor award for it.
I mean, he exploded onto the scene with that movie. I feel like no one knew who he was before that movie.
Yeah.
You know, you have this incredible return to the movie business, now operating at this whole new level, having restructured the pillar institutions of the entertainment business, Viacom and Disney of all things. My God, the biggest entertainment enterprise this side of Netflix now. So now you're going to embark on a move fast and break things moment next, right? And you have this truly, I have to say, and I'm not like blowing smoke up your ass, genuinely radically visionary thing at a time that it's an idea whose time had not yet come but will.
Yeah.
So tell me about Intertainer. How does it get started? What is it? What's the time frame?
In 1996, I had been invited to a conference at Cable Labs in Denver, which was kind of the R&D part of the cable industry. And they showed off a cable modem running video at 1.5 megabits per second. So, I mean, you know, the modems today are running 100 megabits per second.
Right. Yeah, or even 1,000.
But and the conventional telephone modems at those days were running 256 kilobits per second, right? But 1.5 megabits per second was just enough to run what was called MPEG-1.
Yep.
So it just was like a light went on in my head, like, well, if you could do that, then you could, someone anywhere from a server could watch a movie. You know, and you know, I was used to taking my kids every Friday night to Blockbuster and finding that most of the good movies were already checked out, and you used to call it going to the back wall and, you know, trying to find something at Blockbuster that the kids hadn't watched 4 times before, and so it was a very frustrating experience.
There's 2 full generations that have, perhaps, maybe, I think maybe millennials did have some Blockbuster experience, but at least one generation, Generation Z, who have no concept of how deflating it is to go into this store called a video rental store and see the box that's got the art on it, and see none of the blue empty boxes that represent the inventory of tapes. It's like, there's one there it is. Like me and my best friend and business partner Josh, we would walk to Blockbuster from my house every weekend, and it was a ritual. It's like, what are you going to do this weekend? Well, maybe we'll go out, but then we'll definitely rent a movie, or and later rent video games. An industry that is all but totally gone outside of like maybe the Catskills and like places that have become these.
There is supposedly one Blockbuster still existing in Alaska.
Right. Yeah, upstate New York, up north Michigan. There's these, I think you can still go to movie rental places in like small vacation home towns with boating as their primary industry, I think, is where you can find these things.
But so, the idea was that, okay, we know all the movie companies, and if we can make this technology work and build an interface that's fun and easy, then we could probably make a deal with the movie companies to show the movies. And so we did. And, it took us 3 or 4 years, but we finally got to the point that we had a service up and running, had about 140,000 customers, and we would charge by the movie, right? It was a pay-per-view kind of thing.
It was iTunes in the late 90s.
Yeah, it was. You would charge $250 for a movie for 24-hour. You could watch it for 24 hours. And we had about 8,000 movies. And it was really beginning to work. And we had investors from Microsoft and Intel and NBC and Sony, and we had money, and then, unbeknownst to me, in 2000, Sony decided that this was too good a deal, and why should they let us, these little punks, do this? And behind our back, they went and they completely just knocked off everything we did. And, we couldn't patent it, so they probably had a right to do that. And then they went and they created a cartel with all the other majors. It was called MovieLink.
Right.
And literally, the day that was announced, I got a letter from every major studio saying we're no longer going to license our movies to you. And they had clearly done something restraint of trade, it was a cartel. And they were going to exclusively license their online streaming movies to this company, MovieLink. And each of them had a big piece of equity into it. And so we went from having 8,000 movies to having like 8. And so I had to shut it down, and it was the saddest day. I had to fire all these people, and so I had nothing to lose, so I sued them, all the major studios, in antitrust court in the notorious Ninth Circuit. And eventually, I won.
That had to be a terrifying thing to do for a movie producer, to basically become persona non grata, right?
I certainly could not go back into being a movie producer. I mean, that's how I ended up at the Annenberg School. In other words, once I made that move. There was no going back to being a movie producer. So I became a professor, and then it took 4 years, and in 2004, they settled with us just before we were going to go into court. And then I could afford to be a professor. And so, it was an interesting lesson. And my father was an antitrust lawyer, so I thought he was looking down at me with a certain amount of amusement.
So this is an interesting moment to maybe have a little debate, if you will, about where you and I probably differ in terms of thinking about the role of government, which is I could argue, I would argue, I'm going to argue right now that in a sense what you experienced was horrible, but also, in the sweep of history, you can kind of see the way it's even in the absence of a government intervention. I mean, you sued, but didn't. There was no breakup. There wasn't like an antitrust action where, like a monopoly, like an
no, they just had to pay a big fine.
Right, but I think a big argument is often made that government is, if anything, is important to break up these kind of cartels and monopolies, and that's an important central role for government is the antitrust function. And I used to believe that, and I've come to believe that government is actually probably the single biggest creator of monopolies. So it's really kind of a hard thing to expect them to be the one to break them up, and that monopolies are kind of,
in what way?
In 1,000 ways, in 1,000 examples, through sometimes outright, like AT&T, sometimes through regulatory barriers to entry, like the credit rating agencies, where the laws are written such that it's impossible for new ones to enter, and things of that sort. There's a great book by a Marxist economist and historian, Gabriel Kolko, called the Triumph of Conservatism, which talks about the way that sort of the administrative state became this sort of pro-trust enterprise, this monopoly creator.
Well, look, I agree with you in the sense that I think that government has been on the side of the trusts since the early 50s. I think that is a factor of a misreading of the antitrust laws, and a lot of it has to do with a Yale professor named Robert Bork, who eventually Reagan tried to appoint to the Supreme Court. And Bork had this theory, which was called the consumer welfare theory, which was that if two firms merged and prices didn't go up, then there was no harm. And so under that theory, Amazon could buy every single retailer in America, and we know they could keep prices down because they have what's known as monopsony power, because they're the middleman. Just look at the book business. I know from fact, book publishers cannot raise prices. Amazon won't let them. So I think that was a misplaced kind of piece of interpretation of the laws. It's not like the laws need to change at all. If we went back to the kind of standards that Justice Brandeis had set forth, which is that competition is what's important. It wasn't that John D. Rockefeller was raising prices on oil at the gasoline pump in 1906.
Right, Standard Oil was the lowest, actually.
He was crushing every competitor. He was making it impossible for anyone to compete with him. And so he had 80% market share. And so, my problem with the tech monopolies right now is the following. And I think you may have experienced this. So Amazon, for instance, has a huge number of third-party sellers that sell content through them. And occasionally one of them begins to really do well, like diapers.com. And Amazon has all the data. They see where the traffic's coming from. Why is this one taking off and this one isn't? And Amazon says, well, either we'll buy them, like Zappos or diapers.com, and we'll buy them, but when we offer to buy them, we'll make it clear to them, if they don't sell, here's what's going to happen. We're going to go into the white label business and do what they do, and they won't survive. The same thing with Google. The whole case why Google was sued for $2.7 billion in the EU was this: that Google was supposedly a neutral search engine. But if you went to search for restaurant recommendations or travel recommendations, they would always push their own product that they're pushing up to the top, and if you're Yelp or something, you're pushed down on the second page and nobody's going to see you. And so that's the problem with these monopolies. They're not playing fair.
And this will be fun. We can debate this a little bit. So because we actually had this kind of exact debate about the internet service providers, the landline, like cable providers, going back to the old your blog days. And the point I was going to make, and that I would make in many of these cases, although I do think the social networks are distressingly concentrated, so I share that concern with you big time. But like, let's take what your experience with Intertainer. So it's unjust the way they, at some level, the way those companies came together. They crushed you, and then they didn't even create anything good as a result. Movie Link flopped.
They ended up abandoning the whole thing 3 years later.
And I think so, for the skeptic of capitalism, you say, look, this is the natural order of things. You have, even Adam Smith said it, that you take a couple businessmen and put them in a room, and they're going to immediately start conspiring to rig the system, rig the rules. And yet, if you play this game out, if you let the clock keep ticking, so long as there's freedom of entry, which admittedly can be privately impeded the way it was for you, but still there was no legal barrier to coming in and start and competing. You can ultimately have a Netflix who succeed. I mean, you literally were you had the vision for Netflix 2.0 before Netflix 1.0 even came out. And so I think that the market process in general is the most corrosive force for breaking down monopolies that we've got. I think government intervention is always at best a sloppy second. I mean, if I can go through a couple other examples just to make the case, and then you can kind of push back on my laissez-faire liberalism. The Microsoft case. So Microsoft's internet browser is kind of a great example of even the power of Google. You have this natural network effect. Surely this is a natural monopoly. There's network effects for the more websites that use Internet Explorer, the more web developers are going to develop specifically for Internet Explorer. They had, at one point, Internet Explorer had 95% market share. There was a big antitrust case brought against Microsoft, but it ultimately didn't do anything. And yet,
of course it did.
Well, it constrained Microsoft in this and that way.
No. But John, you forget. If you bought a PC with Windows on it, you had to use Internet Explorer.
Well, it was default.
You could not separate the browser. That was the whole thing.
Right, the bundling. The argument was that they were bundling the two products. But you could still, right? So this is my point.
No, you couldn't. That was the problem for the startup that Andreessen was running.
Netscape. Well, so I mean this part. I mean I'll pull my geek card. So the way it worked so it was Windows 98 that first did this integration, and what they did was they married the web browser with the file browser. So if you click the little file explorer, you could be browsing your files, and then if you typed in a web address in the area that had your file path, it would become a web browser. And so yes, in that sense they were married, but you weren't prevented from downloading and installing and using Netscape.
In 95, I don't believe in Windows 95, I don't believe you could install a new browser.
No, you could. You might not have been able to set it as. I mean, this was the early days, but you could, because I remember, because I ran Netscape on my Windows PCs. But that it was that bundling.
It was really hard.
It was that bundling effect.
You had to be a fucking super geek like John Papola.
Well, that could be true. No, and I think that's the argument, right? It's like, okay, well, mom and pop that buy a Dell, they're not going to do that. So, and that's the argument being made now in the EU about search defaults and stuff like that.
But look, I mean, let me just push back on one other thing.
Please.
If you think that the market is always going to have the right solution, then you should talk to Evan Spiegel at Snapchat. So here's Snapchat, and they're a strappy young company out of Venice, California, and they decide to take on Facebook, and they developed this thing called Snapchat Stories, which was a kind of innovative social experience where you could actually draw on the pictures, and you could illustrate things, and it was kind of fun. And all of a sudden it began to get a lot of traction, and they got up to about 90 million users, and Facebook came to Snapchat and said, and at this point Snapchat was a year plus old, right? And they said, we want to buy you for $3 billion. And Evan was just arrogant enough to say no. And as the negotiators were leaving his office, they basically said, well, you're going to regret this, So they went home, and they immediately cloned everything that they did and made it WhatsApp stories, Instagram stories, Facebook stories.
Right.
And then they waited until just when Snap was going public, and that Snap went public at $30 a share, and 2 weeks before that, they brought out these 3 knockoffs. They didn't even change the name. Brought 3 knockoffs out, and they came out at $30 a share, and today Snap's stock is probably $12 a share. And it never got back up to its IPO price. In other words, everybody who ever bought Snapchat stock lost money. And all the employees' stock options are underwater, and Snap is firing people, and and whether they survive or not is not the issue. The point is that they were crippled.
Well, I think yes, sure. I would let me refine my. I don't believe that the market, and here when I say the market, I'm not meaning the stock market, just the market economy, the sort of system of thousands and thousands of companies and people competing. I don't think it always comes up with the right answer. I think, in fact, that it's almost always coming up with this massive mix of could be right, lots of wrong. And it's that so to me, I'm very much a process guy. I think it's that process and that process playing out over time that moves us towards better and away from worse. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make is that I think that so Internet Explorer gets bundled in a way that's really really advantageous for itself and leveraging the 95% market share of Windows, and yet that bundled function is not removed by the antitrust claim. The Windows 98 and then Windows ME and then Windows XP continue to have Internet Explorer shipping integrated and by default, and yet along comes Chrome, Firefox, and then Chrome, to the point where now, 30 years later, Microsoft has actually announced that they are abandoning. I actually find this scary in the opposite direction, but it's illustrative of the bigger sweep. They're abandoning their independent maintenance of the Internet Explorer web engine, and they're going to be adopting the Chromium open source web engine. And I think that was unquestionably overall this market process, even in the face of these obstacles of these incumbent players.
Yeah, but the market process did not start to work until after the antitrust action had been brought, because you may be right that if you were a super geek, you could install Netscape, but once in the consent decree with Microsoft, they had to make it that you could actually opt in to choosing your browser.
Sure.
When you first installed, and that made a huge difference.
And I'm sure it's not as black and white and I'm making. I'm sure that did play a role. Although I think the other interesting part in all this, which you were a part of with Intertainer, is that I think the dynamic that's often lost when people talk about antitrust is how the nature of paradigm shifts. So you were instigating a paradigm shift, and you were a little early, and not a little. I mean, you were amazingly early, but you were early. But Netflix, on the entertainment side, pulled it off. Again, I think for different reasons and different timing, but they've brought about this paradigm shift where, they're now a studio. They're now, I think, probably the biggest studio as far as just amount of money being spent on original content financed by Netflix.
Right.
And I think the same thing happened on the technology side with the iPhone and web browsing, because when Apple released the iPhone, it ran and continues to run mobile Safari. And so even more amazing than the Microsoft's abandonment of Internet Explorer today, just this past year, they no longer make a phone operating system at all. It's impossible not to remember the Steve Ballmer laughing about the iPhone. It's $600 and it doesn't have a keyboard.
Right.
These guys are crazy.
Right.
And they could never get. And so I think to me, and I don't know that you even disagree with this, but I think the thing that I'm a market radical. I would privatize the police, but I think the thing that I like to believe that we could have broad cross-party, cross-ideological consensus about is the value of always preserving the kind of dynamism that allows paradigm shifts to take place. And I think you've obviously it's your whole life has been a series of paradigm shifts. But I feel like increasingly on both the left and the right, there is a kind of conservatism and a desire to lock in entitlements, and I mean that in the broadest sense, privileges for this group or that group, that really I think is sort of so contrary to to the notion of progress that I feel like you and I definitely share. I mean, how do you think about that?
Well, look, I have two thoughts about this. One of which is that I believe that revolutions, whether they're political or they're technological, generally end up in a winner-takes-all situation. You know, and I could point you to Leon Trotsky as an example of a person, and maybe even Paul Ryan, people who came to understand, sadly, that the one who won the revolution was going to take everything. The Republican Party that Donald Trump runs is not the Republican Party that Paul Ryan started out with, and he didn't understand until it was way too late that there was nothing he could do about that. And the same thing for Leon Trotsky, who ended up with an axe in his hand. But I would argue that Jerry Yang was in the same situation, that once you got to a situation where Google was in such power position that there was only going to be one search winner.
Remind people, who is Jerry Yang?
Jerry Yang was the founder of Yahoo. And so in that sense, you know, and Evan Spiegel would probably speak to this as well, you know, in that sense, if these revolutions are such that what's different about the digital age to me is the exponential returns to scale. So, you know, when I was in Economics 101 in 1966, right? You know, professors would talk about diminishing returns to scale. In other words, if you had a factory, you could not just put in 3 times as many workers and think that you would get 3 times the output. It would not happen.
Right. I mean, there's an old saying in software that you know, there might even be a law of relationship. The more at a certain phase in software development, the more programmers you add to the project, the longer it will take to get done. It's a kind of asymptotic disaster. You know, whether it was...
So this is what we call diminishing returns to scale. But think about Facebook. Facebook went from 2 million users to 2 billion users. And they only had to end up adding about 10 times the infrastructure instead of 1,000 times the infrastructure.
Right. Or 1,000,000 times. Right.
Right.
No, it's true. It's the, would you call it, it's almost I don't know if this is like network economics. It's the, you know, yesterday I actually had a friend of mine who you might have come across over the years, Bob Metcalf, in. And
sure, Metcalf's
Law.
Law.
So you're talking about a kind of version of Metcalf's Law.
Totally. And so that's new. That's what I keep trying to, you know, I'm working on this new book, and I'm really trying to get people to understand that we're actually beyond the age of scarcity. And people don't really understand it. That's why, you know, things like solar power is looking more like Moore's Law than anything else. And that's why, you know, Los Angeles just canceled 3 natural gas plants because they realize they can actually do more with solar and wind, and it's cheaper than building another natural gas plant. The whole point, I mean, the cover of Newsweek, of Business Week last week, Bloomberg Business Week, was called Peak Car. So the whole idea was, you know, the students at USC, I mean, even probably in your generation, as soon as you turned 16, you would get your damn driver's license, and you would find some way to get yourself a car.
Oh, I remember. So my birthday is in September, and I was one of the youngest in my grade. So at every key milestone of youth, I would miss a summer. You know, the summer when everybody could drink, I couldn't. The summer when everybody was driving, I couldn't. And man, that must have been...
And it pissed
it
you
was
off.
the worst.
Yeah, right. So, but that's not an issue now. And so, I mean, it's just like, I don't know. I can't remember if you were one of these inflation is right around the corner, this is all going to lead to disaster types. But a lot of people on the right have been telling me for years that, you know, you can't run deficits until it was okay on the right to run deficits. You can't run all these deficits. If unemployment gets to 4%, it's going to be disastrous, and we've got to buy gold because inflation's hitting. It's not happening because the digital revolution is a deflationary thing. Not just Moore's Law, which says that your computer is going to be faster and cheaper next year than this year, but the very fact that if Airbnb is bringing 3,000 new rooms onto the market every month, why the hell would Marriott be starting to build a whole bunch of new hotels? That would be just like insane. If Lyft and Uber are going to be a perfect substitute for the average college student than owning a car, how is the American car business going to sell 18 million cars a year? It's not going to happen. And the fact that in an urban environment, the average car spends most of the time in a garage, it's actually much more efficient to have these, everybody use a community car, so to speak.
It's funny. So first of all, I'm going to say that I was one of the folks who was worried about inflation at the time of the Great Recession when the Fed was increasing its balance sheet dramatically. So I will accept that criticism on getting it wrong. I mean, I'm not going to rely on the fact that, well, I wasn't a formal economist. What the hell do I know? Although that's true. And I think you're right, and I agree with you that I think all economic growth is deflationary, right? Because if, at just the basic level, growth is driven by the ability to create more with less. That's what drives. This is probably one of the two concepts that I am most passionate about. One is the value and the power of bottom-up organization, emergent order. The other is that you get wealthy by creating more stuff, not by consuming more stuff. Christmas doesn't make us rich. Figuring out how to make 2 iPhones with the components that you used to need for making one is what makes us rich. And that is deflationary. You have more stuff and the same amount of dollars. So you're totally right. If you can bring all these empty spare rooms and all these unused cars, since every car is an unused car sitting there parked, that's going to bring prices down radically. And it's got to. I don't know how much of our current sort of relatively low inflation environment is thanks to that, but it's definitely an important part of the story.
I think it's a big factor. And think about it. I mean, what power do workers have to really raise their wages if the substitute of a robot or AI or machine learning is right around the corner? And they all know that. It's not just outsourcing to Thailand or Vietnam. It's that, man, you can be replaced by a machine. I mean, look, I have this thought I've been thinking a lot about, which is that we've created a new class, and I know the notion of class is something that gives you the heebie-jeebies, but economists call them the precariat. And the precariat is below the working class, because the working class still usually has pensions and health care and unions, and they've been able to kind of maintain a wage, whether they're teachers or factory workers. The precariat are this new class of freelancers, and the precariat is split by the API, the application program interface. So a certain portion of the precariat, these freelancers, works above the API. That is, they tell computers what to do. And that's the web designers and the web programmers and the coders and stuff like that. But a much bigger proportion of the precariat works below the API. Computers tell them what to do. So that's the kid in the Amazon warehouse who said, you have 82 seconds to go pick up something over there and bring it over here. And if you don't do it in 82 seconds, you're going to get dinged. That's the kid who drives the Uber. That's the kid, who's driving for Lyft. And there's a lot of those people. The problem is those people can all be replaced by robots relatively easily. And by the way, they're not learning a skill. The other thing that worries me is that jobs that used to be really good jobs, like my college roommate at Princeton has been a radiologist for almost, 45 years. I don't believe that's going to be a job in 5 years.
Yeah, the machine learning algorithms are getting pretty good at that.
And what a radiologist will be a guy who carries the output of the computer to the patient and breaks it to them, the good or the bad news. And they're not going to get paid the kind of way my roommate got paid for doing that job.
I do think there are classes, although I think that I don't like to analyze behavior at the level of the class. I think only people make decisions, and so the way I'm not an atomistic thinker, but I think you have to look at two things happening at once when you think about a concept like class. You have things that are happening at the level of the individual, people making choices for themselves, and then there's these emergent sort of group dynamics that are part of the class or the culture or the society or the community. And I think those are real things. And but we don't have great language for discussing their mechanics, and so we apply the language of individual choice to groups like countries decide, or America and China talk, and and I think that's where me and class style and analysts will part ways. I think, but to your point though about this precariat, it's a very clever term. I don't think you're wrong. I thought you were going to go somewhere else, which was the folks who are being left behind from even those jobs. The folks are sort of that are, cataloged in Charles Murray's Coming Apart. The people who have become disconnected.
Well, that's an even sadder situation. We can talk about
that book's had a huge effect on me.
I agree. Here's my concern about the precariat, because a lot of people in the precariat are doing 2 or 3 jobs, right? They may be doing work, driving for Uber and doing TaskRabbit stuff at night and stuff. But here's the deal. We have got to figure out some sort of safety net for this new generation of workers who have no organized health care, pension, way. I mean, because you don't want them to wind up at 55 and realize they have nothing. Because then that's going to be your generation going to have to carry those people.
I've got a lot of things I struggle with as I think about the problem as you're describing it. So there's some areas where I think you and I agree, and I think there's an interesting kind of consensus that's possible. And then there's areas where we disagree. So one is, I think that where we disagree, I'd say is, for starters, I think the kind of macro narrative that the inequality narrative about wage stagnation and things like that has a lot of holes in it, and we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But I think for another time, wages or total compensation is a better way to think about it, has been going up by and large for every group over the past 30 years and 40 years. There's this sort of narrative that working people haven't made progress since 1970, and it doesn't pass the sniff test of going into a middle class or even a working class family's home versus and imagining what their life was like in 1970. Just the material improvements are unquestionable, but I do think there is
only because Chinese TVs are cheaper.
Right, but I think to that end, whether it's through trade or through technology, I do think that this is the age-old problem of progress, right? That, the sabotage is this term from the Luddites who threw their wooden shoes into the machines. There's called sabot because they didn't want the machines taking their jobs. And we've always had this. I'm not convinced that this time is different, that this new wave of machines is gonna kill us all, just like the tractor is gonna and I'm not saying you're saying that entirely, but
I'm not convinced it is either. I agree with you. I am, quite honestly, I'm waiting to see what's going to happen. I'm worried. I was at a code conference a year and a half ago, and Mark Andreessen was on stage, and he said, in 10 years, the long-haul trucking business of the United States will be totally automated. In other words, the trucks will be autonomous vehicles.
3 million jobs, trucking.
Well, okay, that's interesting. But so he came off stage. Yeah, that's what I said. I said, well, what are you going to do with the 5 million people who are in that business? And he said, that's not my problem. Okay, that's probably honest. But the question are there a lot of politicians who are thinking about that problem? I don't see them. When Steve Mnuchin was asked the same question, are you worried about AI, machine learning, and robotics causing unemployment? He says, oh, that's not even on our radar. That's not going to happen for 100 years. Well, if he'd said that at Goldman Sachs, his former employer, they would have fired his ass. That's the kind of dumb statement that, you get fired for at Goldman Sachs. I know that culture. But you don't get fired in the White House for saying something that's stupid.
It's interesting. It's an interesting challenge. If you had said to someone in 1899 or even 1990, or 1819 or 1919, I think in either year this would be true. There is a new technology coming called the tractor. And in a generation, we are going to go from 60% of Americans being farmers or 40% of Americans being farmers to 1% being farmers. The exact same protest would be leveled. Are we all going to starve to death? Is there going to be riots in the streets? What's everybody going to do? And the reality is we're going to do things that you couldn't even imagine, right? You're going to have jobs like being a software developer for a thing that at the time didn't yet exist called a computer. And we're going to be creating businesses teaching people how to do the things that the rich used to do for fun, like learn how to play musical instruments and speak languages. And so I am a little bit of a cornucopian, I'll admit that. There's a certain trap, and this might be a tautological trap I've put myself in, which is I either have to believe that people are capable of, through a trial and error sort of evolutionary process, figuring our way towards the next things, or we're kind of fucked, because the alternative is we aren't good at figuring it out, at which point I don't see how those same people are going to vote our way to a solution. So I feel a little bit like we sort of have to. This is how I feel about climate change, to be perfectly honest. And we don't have to go down a deep road on here, but I think there is, I think, obviously, I think it's clear that human activity contributes to climate change in some meaningful way. It's also clear that the political process is not capable of doing things doing things to address it. If you look at the riots in France over like just a hike in the gas tax. So either we're gonna innovate our ways out of this thing, or we're doomed, because there's no political solution. And these sort of cockamamie, 5-year planning on steroids for the 21st century things that are happening in Congress, like the Green New Deal and these, we're going to engineer society from the top down. That's never worked. That'll never work, even if the intentions are good. And I feel like we face the same problem with what you're describing, right? You're talking about millions and millions of people with millions and millions of potential alternative paths they could take, and it's not obvious which way they'll go. But I'd like to believe it should be settled science that we can't predetermine it in advance with some kind of plan.
Yeah, but the problem is that as computers get better at anything that is repetitive behavior, we're constantly chasing workers from activities of lowest value into repetitive behaviors of far higher value.
Yep.
The problem is that computers are eventually going to be able to do anything that it's a repetitive behavior, so that what the people who survive are the people like you who do one-offs that are creating something that has never been done before. You're not doing things that are repetitive, right? But the problem is, are there enough of those one-offs around? And it could be, I don't know if you know who Eric Weinstein is.
Yep, I do.
It's a, mathematician that works for Peter Thiel. And he basically says, that we may need a kind of hybrid of much more free market capitalism and a kind of socialism, because a lot of the things of, as you said, teaching people how to read, speak foreign languages or play music or something like that may not be remunerative. And it may be that the maid in my hotel room in Nassau, Bahamas last week is a brilliant singer. But will she be able to make a living doing that? That's questionable, because, 80, like many things, 80% of the value in the music business goes to 1% of the performers. So I'm open to conceiving that there will be lots of new jobs that we haven't thought of. Nobody has come to me and tell me what those jobs will be yet. And so it could be that there's going to have to be some kind of strange hybrid system. And quite honestly, I'm not satisfied with Mark Zuckerberg or, anybody else saying, well, it'll be universal basic income. I think that's a non-starter in the United States. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, it's funny. So, and I think like this is a great topic for us to sort of bring this all full circle, right? So I was very influenced and continue to be by Friedrich Hayek's work. I think he continues to, the deeper I read into him, the more I look at the way he straddled so many different disciplines, and whether it was complexity theory or even the philosophy of science, and he was a hardcore free marketeer. He also basically believed, like Milton Friedman, in some kind of a universal basic income style safety net. For Milton Friedman, it was called the negative income tax. Hayek sort of treated it under a principle that I think is a very fundamentally liberal, at least in the classical sense, principle of universality of treatment, that we're all created equal. We should be equal under the law. Our programs should treat us all equally. So, the idea of cutting everybody the same check and letting them then do what they want. There's good. I'm very sympathetic to that. Leaving aside, I don't think there's any government in heaven, right? I'm not you'll be hard pressed to find me ever say I think there's a good thing for government to do. But I do know it's good at taking money from people and cutting checks. It's good at that, and it's good at killing people on battlefields. It's not so good at planning detailed decisions that are best left to the people with the knowledge and the incentives. And it seems to me like you and I are of kindred spirits here, as decentralists, and so we in a way I feel like if there's a kind of new Nordic model where we have less sort of top down administrative mucking around, much less crony capitalism and special privilege deals, and but at the same time we have something that's more uniform and more evenly provided as a safety net. That seems like a step in the right direction.
I'm right with you there. I mean, I think, the thing that, I don't know if you're willing to embrace this, but the new book I'm writing is called America After Empire. And what it imagines a world in a kind of post-scarcity economy. Because I think a lot of the problems that we're facing right now are this notion that, I've got to take from you because there's only so much stuff. And anybody who's worked in the digital economy knows that that's just not the way the world's going to work anymore. But there are priorities that the government is going to have to choose. And we choose, I've just been the last 2 years, I've been on this constant book tour because every 3 months my book gets published in another country. And so I've been in China, I've been in Taiwan, I've been in Korea, I've been in Italy, I've been in Spain, I've been in France. And I ride on these high-speed trains past these giant wind farms, and I think, wow, this is really amazing. How did they afford, these countries that are much poorer than us, how do they afford to have such beautiful airports and all this infrastructure and stuff like that? Well, the obvious thing is they're not spending $800 billion a year on a military, trying to be the unpaid policeman of the world.
Yeah, no doubt about that.
And at some point, both left and right is going to have to agree on this, that this is the biggest boondoggle. Talk about crony capitalism. And Eisenhower warned us about it, in 1960, his farewell address. He said, watch out. I've been a general. I know these people are going to try and take all the fucking money. And they've succeeded. We spend 60% of our discretionary budget on the military. It's insane. And so, look, I differ from you in the sense that I do believe that there are some large tasks that only a government can organize. And one of those is that we have to convert from a kind of oil-based, carbon-based economy to a more alternative fuel economy. And that is wind, solar, water, geothermal, nuclear, whatever the hell. And I think that government has a role in organizing. Now, the market has a huge role in organizing it too. And so people like Alan Greenspan and George Shultz and James Baker think that, okay, we just have a carbon tax, and that will then at least price carbon in a way that it figures into the calculations of the market to make decisions as to how they're going to invest. And maybe that's the solution. But I also believe if we could take $300 billion a year out of the Pentagon and put it towards some big projects that are, on the level of building the interstate highway system, on the level of going to the moon. That would be good for the society. Because part of the reason people don't have any trust in the government anymore, and by the way, trust in the U.S. government is at an all-time low.
Yeah, no question.
And part of the reason is they don't believe it can do anything for anybody.
I think it's a very interesting time to try to have dialogues like we're having at the level of this exact problem, because I think that, so as someone who's spent the past decade becoming very classical liberal or libertarian or whatever you want to call it, I voted for Bush in 2000 and 2004. I was a young guy. I was raised like an Italian Catholic conservative, and I didn't really get activated in thinking about this stuff in a serious way until the financial crisis. So, if I look back on it, I've become, and I think, radicals like Murray Rothbard were among the most vocal on this, very, very fundamentally anti-war and anti-military industrial complex. And I think you and I, there's no air between us on that. So here. There's also, you said 60% of the discretionary budget. Well, okay. The whole budget's discretionary, and the military is only like 16 or 20% of the whole federal budget, which is somewhere around $4 trillion. I think yes, you and I should be able to lock arms and say, can we have a new type of compromise where we both make cuts on the sacred cows on the left and right to try to get things to be rational? Absolutely. I don't think there's enough money in that pot to get us all the way to the plans that have been put forward. And so we're left with this problem, and I'd love for you to just sort of take us out on this. I think the political right, the sort of, at least the formal political right, the Republicans, if they have, in my view, and this is not fundamentally a political show, or when we don't do political work with politicians or candidates at Emergent Order, but I believe that the political right apparatus and party has basically given up on ideas. And so you have an era where we are sub 4% unemployment, and we have deficits equivalent to the Obama stimulus that caused me to become an activist and make my rap videos about the dangers of fiscal policy. And so I don't see it. I'm totally flabbergasted by that, but not surprised, because this is fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, because the last time the Republicans controlled everything under Bush in the early 2000s, they did the same thing. They spent all the money. But I would like to hear, I would like to sort of conclude our conversation hearing how you, I wouldn't even say mea culpa, but that's my sort of dig on the right, is that they're not stepping up in the political domain, and so you have to have outside enterprises like the folks at the Koch Institute and others trying to instigate new conversations. On the left, it sure seems like the energy is not moving towards a kind of new federalist, new left of Jon Taplin, but towards a kind of new central planner mentality. The Green New Deal thing that circulated was maybe some half-baked high school scheme. I don't know what that document was, but the general mentality seems to be one of very top-down decision-making, and I don't see a lot of the energy and a lot of toleration for imagining how we might marry these things. And the last thing I'll say about that, and then I would love to just hear your thoughts on it, is the Scandinavian countries are brought up as being these so-called democratic socialist societies, and yet they bear almost no resemblance to what seems to be the emerging platform on the political left in the United States that claims to believe that we should be more like them. So the Nordic countries have their mix is, we have low corporate taxes. We have incredibly loose and relatively unregulated or lightly regulated labor and business markets. So very free enterprise. They're capitalist societies. We have these fairly efficient, robust, and in many cases very decentralized welfare systems. So like Sweden's healthcare system is locally funded and administered in its various states. It's not Medicare for all. And then how do we pay for it? We don't pay for it by taxing the rich like you do in the United States. We pay for it by taxing everybody to pay for everybody through heavy sales taxes. And the flip side for these Nordic countries is they're culturally homogenous societies with incredibly high degrees of trust because literally everybody's 3 degrees separate from one another. And the second you have someone with slightly darker skin come into the picture, they're throwing up walls and sounding like Trump and raising the sort of nationalist right-wing flag. And so my sort of question for you, and take as much time as you like, is where do we head from here as a body politic, and where do your sort of kindreds on the political left go to meet someone like me in the middle?
Well, I will start just by saying that I think that the kind of far left of the Democratic Party is untethered from reality. And, you know, when people start throwing around words like revolution, I remember back to 1968 in my dorm room in Princeton. I had a close friend who was the president of the Students for Democratic Society. And I was hearing all sorts of people saying, oh, there's going to be a revolution. They didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. And by the way, by the end of the year, we had Richard Nixon as our president. It was the antithesis of everything they were talking about. So, I mean, that's my fear. So, I mean, look, these people are young, a lot of them. I mean, one of them is very old, and that bothers me just as much, because I think it's time for my generation to surrender power to your generation. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think America is basically a center-left country. I know you're going to say it's a center-right country, but I don't really think
no,
that's
I think we're fairly
true.
populist. I would actually I would tend to agree with you on that.
It is a moderate country. You know, most people think of themselves as moderates, and you know, even the recent Gallup poll right after the November election showed that both Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents want the Democratic Party to be more moderate, not more liberal. So my hopes, quite honestly, are moving towards your fellow Texan, Beto O'Rourke, because I think he is not a screaming radical in any stretch of the imagination. He wants to solve the immigration problem, and I think he could do it, but he also believes in listening to everybody. He's just the kind of person that we could have had as a third part of this conversation. I mean, I've had a couple of conversations with him, and I've corresponded with him a little bit, and I think he's extraordinarily savvy. And I also think that he's one of those rare politicians like Bobby Kennedy who can attract people from all sorts of walks of life. And if he can get young people to vote, which he did seem to do in Texas, despite the very overwhelming odds that he had against him, being Texas, he did pretty damn well. And so on a national basis, I think he could be the right candidate. I mean, I look at the rest of the field, and I'm not that enthusiastic. I think Sherrod Brown is an interesting character. I'm just not sure if he's charismatic enough or he knows how to raise money the way Beto does. And so...
What about at the level of ideas, John?
Okay, so at the level of ideas, look, I think that a lot of interesting things are happening at the city level. I mean, I just know what's happening here in Los Angeles. A lot of innovation is happening here in Los Angeles, whether it's mass transit, whether it's food safety, whether it's, trying to deal with the homeless problem. All of these things are not coming down from Washington at all. And so in that sense, I'm encouraged. That's why I wrote that piece for Harper's. I just think that, what's going to have to happen is we're all going to have to stop thinking that the brilliance is going to flow out of Washington, D.C., because it isn't. And, the way the Senate is configured, as Norm Ornstein has said, in 20 years, 70 seats in the Senate could be controlled by, 30% of the states. It's just insane. 30% of the population,
So, so how do you, what would be what's your manifesto, your...
Well, my manifesto is, look, we do need a candidate and somebody who's going to lead us, but in general, the theory is we have to do two big things on the national level. One is we've got to radically restructure the military-industrial complex. And then I would take that money and I would try and do three big things. One, I would try and move us, not the Green New Deal, but just move the economy, whether partially through tax incentives and carbon tax, and partially through investment towards an alternative energy economy. This country can run itself with the kind of batteries that are being developed by people like Elon Musk and everything. The notion that, you just got to watch TV while the wind is blowing, like the idiot Trump says, it's bullshit. It's total bullshit. You can store energy. It's not that hard. And so the fact that, where you live and where I live, it's sunny a lot of the time. And there's just unbelievable amount of unbelievably inexpensive energy to be used. And by the way, the curve on solar is the same curve as Moore's Law in terms of price curve.
Yeah, I saw a presentation by someone at a Silicon Valley that was basically talking about this logarithmic,
and if Trump wasn't
power
being
law.
An idiot with making it impossible for the Chinese to import solar panels, it would be even better. That's not helping anything. So that's one thing. The second big thing is when I was at Princeton in the 60s, I had a friend who went to Berkeley, lived in California, went to Berkeley, and the total cost for a year at the best college, one of the best colleges in America, was $800. And he was a poor kid, he wasn't a richy rich. So he got a world-class education for $800 a year. Now, we may not be able to get that far down, but we need to figure out a way where the lower income people can get a world-class education. Because quite frankly, you're not going to be able to succeed on muscle power anymore in the future. The muscle power will all be robots. I'm sorry. It's just, that's the way it is, because they don't get unions and they don't get health care, and they're just going to be cheaper. So you're going to have to use your brain, and how exactly what those jobs are going to be, I don't for the life of me know. But if they are, they're going to be brain jobs. They're going to be jobs where you use a computer, but you augment the computer and you add some kind of human, empathetic aspect to it. So somehow there is $1.5 trillion of student debt right now. That's untenable. If you start your life with $100,000 of debt, the chance for you to do something entrepreneurial like you're doing, John, is almost impossible.
Yeah, we've seen we've seen a lot of money poured into the system, and we've seen a lot of very nice student quads and football stadiums and lazy rivers built with it.
Oh, it's terrible. Oh no! Look, don't get me started about how much money is wasted.
USC emeritus, you know it firsthand.
No, it's scary. And the amount of money that goes into the administration of these colleges as opposed to goes into the teachers is a scandal. And I hope somebody's going to start writing about it, because it's ridiculous.
Well, let's end on what are you most optimistic about for America and for our future in general?
I quite honestly, as you know well, I believe that we are in an interregnum in which the old is dying and the new is not yet born. But I think we're getting close to the place where the new, that is, the digital economy, can really actually allow us to get out of this scarcity mindset where I have to take from you in order for me to succeed. We're living in an age of oversupply and abundance, and if we're smart, we'll know how to do that.
Well, on that note, John, I'm gonna say onward and upward.
It was a really fun conversation, John.
Well, and here's to many more, my friend.
Okay, great.
All right.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.